Chapter 19, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And again, as he opens up this chapter, he reminds them, and the Lord doesn't put all this and repeat himself so many times because he said, well, otherwise the Bible would have been shorter. I need more content, so I'm going to repeat myself. No. The Lord repeats himself, and he brings much of this in here for emphasis. He wants to get our attention because we're a people that, we wander, and our eyes wander, and our minds wander, and our hearts wander. We need our attention in God again. And so the Lord gets their attention again and says, look, I'm the one speaking to you. You're going to do this because this is what I'm like, and I am your God. I'm your Redeemer and your Master. And I'm not asking you to be superhuman, because God's not human. What he is putting out there is something that is from divine origins, not from human origins. His love, his honor, his respect. We don't look to the world around us. We don't look to good people or good philosophers or great thinkers. We look to the Lord because they're his. These are not of human origins, but of the Lord. Christ's likeness is really what we are going for in all of it. What would God do in your situation? Again, before we proceed, it's that reminder that we cannot divorce morality and theology. They're connected. What we think about God, who we think he is, what his place in our life will be reflected in our walk. What we think about God is the most important thing about us, and it will come out. And God is reminding him this, that it should come out, it will come out, so let us focus and let us know. Let us not be ignorant, as Peter would say, about our conduct. Verse 3 says, Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Revere simply really kind of just means to respect, to obey. We talked about it in previous weeks, so I won't spend too much time on it. Again, the constant reminder that the family is the building blocks of a nation, of a society, of a community, everything. And he focuses a fair amount in this chapter on the relationship to the elderly and to the father and to the mother. He says you're to have reverence. You're to respect that. You're going to have these building blocks of holiness in your life, and it's not only going to be for you personally and individually, but it's going to be a part of your home. It's going to be a part of your home. And though your children will choose for themselves eventually who they will serve, he says, but this is how you're going to build it. And as he mentions the Sabbath there, it really was a mark of their country, a mark of their relationship with God, an expression of it personally. And both nationally and personally, as they would have this mark of the Sabbath in their life, it was something, if you think about it, would have been quite a step for a family. Not just weekly, because that's not all the Sabbaths that they would keep. But when it would come around and that 6th year would end, and you say, well, don't worry about it, son. We're not going out to plow the field because we're not working it this year. This is a Sabbath year, and we're not going to work it. We're going to trust that God has already provided us enough, not only for the Sabbath year, but also that it would get us through the 8th year and reseeding. And the Lord would bless them in the 6th year, and then they would have to trust and walk them out. Imagine going into a country. You're tootling along, and you're flying into wherever. And you land, and you notice that, does anybody work around here? No, it's a Sabbath year. We're taking the entire year off. How does that work? Well, you got to trust in the Lord. I mean, I don't, because that would be weird. That would be strange to me. But yet God would provide. And so it would be a commitment. It would be a significant part of your upbringing would be Sabbaths and serving the Lord, learning to obey and honor your parents. And God works in their lives personally here. And it's quite interesting. But there is a connection between reverencing, honoring, and obeying. We'll just use that. Your parents and the connection to the reverence that you'll have for the Lord. Not an absolute, but there is a connection in there that is worth noting. And there is just something challenging when the younger generation is at war with the older generation. The Lord's going to touch on that a couple more times in this chapter, and we're rapidly approaching that. Well, I wouldn't say we're approaching that. We are diving headlong into that in our culture today, of this battle of no longer, as we have no longer, painting with a broad brush, of course, as a country, honoring our father and our mother in those positions in the home. We see it playing out now in our society. I mean, I think of when I was coming through school and growing up, it was in vogue that it wasn't genetics weren't your issue, or society wasn't the problem. It was your parents' fault. I don't know how many of you are anywhere close to my age, but that was a big thing. It was your upbringing. It was what your parents taught you, and I think we begin to see some of the fruits of that in our culture today. We see the fruits of not honoring a God-given position. I wouldn't be surprised, and I suppose that, a younger president wouldn't be the most horrible thing, but I wouldn't be surprised in my lifetime, in the next couple decades, that when the vote swings back to the Democratic Party on one of the swings, that you get an exceptionally young president out of it. Because you see in the politics that, and especially in the Democratic Party right now and the independents, that there is this massive swing to the younger generation. And they have very little use for the older generation. If you need much on that, just look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her battles with the older generation, even within their own party. That there is something brewing, something manifesting itself in all of this, and I suspect we'll see it more in our lifetime. I pulled up a article which I almost forgot about, so give me 1 second. And it was done. Let's see, by a group called Salon, and so it was a kind of an op-ed thing written. And it picks up here. Ocasio-Cortez, this was by a colleague that was writing this about her, as she sees it, is a prime example of what Crowley calls a tall poppy syndrome. Crowley explains tall poppy syndrome occurs when someone gets cut down to size after becoming too big for their britches, too important, too fast, too superior to those around her. The tall poppy must be pruned back, lest she think she can easily dominate her peers. She must be taught a lesson. As Crowley goes about trying to teach Ocasio a lesson, employing an abundance of anti-millennial imagery to make her point, with her relative youth, Taylor Swift red lipstick and deft use of social media, unapologetic embrace of socialism, Crowley writes, Ocasio-Cortez became an instant political celebrity. The mainstream media painted her as and her radical ideas for Medicare for all and Green New Deal, 70% tax rate, her dripping sarcasm on Twitter, and her announcement of self-care break before being sworn in. Crowley goes on to describe Ocasio-Cortez as the stereotypical millennial who, at her first job interview, asked for the corner office and 8 weeks of vacation, quoting various Democrats who have mildly criticized her on occasion, including former Senator, anyways. Goes on, and oftentimes her responses to the criticism from those who had gone before her is that basically we don't have much use for you. Guys are old school. You guys have had your day. You're gone. You're down. You're out. And so I don't bring up that article specifically to put her down or anything else like that, but to highlight as these older ladies who were serving, her peers were writing an op-ed saying, you're coming in and there's just this battle for respect between the older and the younger. Ready for change, out with the old and in with the new. There was a saying once that if in a room an older person should never have to remind the younger person of their age, of the honor due them. Should never have to outwardly speak it, should never have to say it. The younger person should never forget it. And unfortunately, in an article like that, you have perhaps an older generation that has not deserved a whole lot of respect, and you have a younger generation that doesn't give it. And I think it'll be quite interesting to see as the days roll on, the continued battle between. Really, we live in this culture that's obsessed with youth, obsessed with being young and vibrant, and the older generation, as I believe, we're so self-focused. Perhaps, I'm not sure what all the roots are, that there's this obsession with youth. And as the younger generation's coming up, they don't have much use for the older because, well, we'll just search it on the internet. And we'll get all of our knowledge there. We don't have to wait to learn anything. We'll just learn it now, and I don't have any use for you. Of course, knowledge and wisdom are different, but I don't know if I'll even find the end of this conversation at this point tonight. But it is interesting that God would command it to bring it in. And he says this is going to be a building block, and you're going to build it into your families. In the Japanese time, so most of it's translated, they're experiencing it as well, though I believe America's a pioneer on it. A witness to a scene that unfolded in a line on one Sunday evening, an elderly man and a woman boarded the train at Kawasaki and moved over to the priority or designated seating area for pregnant women and elderly people, or people with disabilities. The man, as the elderly man proceeded over to this designated area, he stood in front of a yet much younger man, presumed to be in his 30s, sitting there, headphones plugged in, and fast asleep. After waiting a few minutes, the elderly man said in a voice loud enough to penetrate those headphones, and that part's not translated. Oh, wait, no, here it is. When we were young, we would always give up our seats for the elderly. Now the young just pretended to sleep and refused to take notice. At this, the younger man opened his eyes and said, I had to work on a Sunday, and you're just playing around drawing a pension. I'm the one who's paying for your pension, okay? The older man didn't say a word and got off at the next station. The younger guy sank back into his seat. And so we see this honor, this respect fading really kind of everywhere in the modern times. Japan, which would have been a culture very based in honor and shame, as it goes there as well. And as Paul said it would in the end times. But the Lord says in your family, in your home, in your building block for what you're doing to serve me, you're going to start building honor there. Son, you'll hold that door whether you know that person or not, whether they earn the respect or not, because that's right. I think there's a certain level that we have to remember in honoring, for a popular example, the President of the United States. Whether it's the current one or the next one or the previous one. Now, as an individual, they may or may not earn or deserve, but as a God-given position, we're going to have a certain level of respect in that. Because if we begin to pick and choose our own places, it will slowly erode into all places. Each generation has a fresh challenge to develop respect and honor in their community, in their culture, in their family. Because at any moment, we can transform a country one family at a time. That's the way one comes undone, and that's why one gets put back together. And each generation that goes before the younger should strive to be worthy of the respect to do it. Not just because you're aged, or not just because you're a father or mother, but will you strive to be worthy of the office or the position that's given you? If you have that place in their family, will you honor the Lord with it? So that as they're commanded to reverence, to obey, to honor you, that it's easy. Because you've been worthy of the calling that God has given to you in that. Verse 4, do not turn to idols, nor to make yourselves molten gods. I am the Lord your God. And if you offer a sacrifice of peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it of your own free will. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, and on the next day, and if any remains until the third day, it shall be burned in the fire. And if it is eaten at all on the third day, it's an abomination or detestable. It shall not be accepted. Therefore, everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned the hallowed offering of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. All right, so the Lord says one thing you're going to do, even though idols are nothings, these nothings, don't make them. And oftentimes you just simply make them in the image that you want to see. The image that you want. Lots of idols in this world still today, though we fashion them quite differently. Some are green with presidents on them. Some drive down the road. Many idols in our life. He says, don't fashion those. Don't fashion them. They're not to be a place in your life. And then after he says, don't make something that's not real. Don't substitute the Lord for something man-made. And then you don't do that. He says, now make sure you take the time to sacrifice a peace offering. Not just something that's required. This is one that you're gonna stop and you're gonna say, boy, I haven't got with the Lord in a little while. I haven't just stopped and enjoyed the peace of God, peace with God, and just communed with Him in a while. He says, stop and do that. Enjoy peace with me. Don't let it go stale. Don't let it sit for days, but stop and enjoy that. Eat and fellowship in His presence. Enjoy the peace that His Son has given you. Life is, as he talks about the peace offering and the Sabbaths, it reminds us, and we need this in America, that life is not all about production. I worked in production for most of 20 years, and that's a hard mentality to break, because the more you produce, the better it is. The more you make, that's great. But life is not all about production. God didn't make us just simply as endless producing machines. He made us to be relational. with him and with others. It is right to work. God commanded it after the fall, especially. It's good for us to be and to live productive lives. But he said in the process of being focused, in the process of living life and getting things done, don't make yourself idols. Don't let things get out of proper proportion. Stop and come back and spend time with me. See, because there's an interesting thing that Jesus said. He said, man wasn't made for the law, wasn't made for rules. It blew him away as the Pharisees' lives were dependent upon rules. And you're not doing it right, Jesus. You're not doing it right, Jesus. You're not keeping those things right. And he reminded them, God didn't have a bunch of rules and say, man, I just don't have anybody to obey these. Let's make somebody. No. Rules, laws, they were given to bless man, and particularly after we had strayed from the Lord. But it is not our purpose in life to simply carry out and to obey. But it's to fellowship with him, to have peace with him, to worship the Lord. He says, make sure you take time to do that. Verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, and you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord, your God. I like how someone once said, it's not welfare, this is workfare. And depending on who you read the estimates, some rabbis would have it about 15%. It kind of ranged between 10% and 20% of how much the field would produce that this would actually result in leaving behind. Well, you'd have a hard time convincing a modern farmer to do that, leaving 10 to 20% of your field for somebody just come and grab up. But yet he left it. He says you're going to leave that. As people come down and your field runs alongside the road, they're going to be able to gather as they will. The stranger, the poor person, they're going to be able to come in and get that. It is good, again, as much as it's good to stop and rest with the Lord, it is good for a person to get out and to provide for their own needs. Even if you didn't have the means of the job, you had to get up and you had to go provide for that. And I think it's interesting, if you were to take the time and really study out the parallel, especially here on the left coast, that as we have increased our social programs with no accountability, so have the increased needs of our social programs, to where we spend, I would dare say, billions from California to Washington, including Oregon, on just providing for people. Now, we'll come back to it a little bit, and so I don't want to say that includes those who cannot help themselves, because God says you're gonna pay attention to them here later. But we're talking about people who can. And there is something that's damaging to the human being when you strip that from them. He says you're going to provide it. They're going to have the opportunity, but they're going to have to get up and go do it. And there'll be no reason not to. And so he says you're going to take care of them that way. And really, is a lot of this, as they're learning to love their neighbor, it's going to fall right in the category of, if you were poor or down and out or, whatever happened, what would you want out there for you? And I think it would be just an opportunity if the Lord left a way. And so he does for that. So that's a good reminder in all of these things, in many of these laws. It's a good reminder of self-restraint also. Don't try to get every little thing out. Remember others. Again, we really value efficiency as well in many things. the Lord says, make sure that in your process of doing a good job and honoring me with your field, that you do set something, you do think about others in the process of your life and what you're producing, and really ultimately what the Lord's blessing you with. God will provide for many in this way, and one of the most beautiful ones would come later as he would provide for Ruth through this method. As she would come in as a stranger from a distant land, didn't have anything, hanging out with her mother-in-law and poor, and she was able to, and God used this very provision later for her and in the lineage of both King David and Jesus, and they were able to provide for their needs that way. Verse 11, you shall not steal nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another, and you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not cheat your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until the morning. God doesn't want for us who carry his name, to proclaim his name, and then to throw mud on his name. To profane his name simply means to make it common. Well, I'm doing this in the name of the Lord, and then I lie, cheat, and steal, or hold back your wages. Well, I guess your God's just like everybody else. It's common. There's nothing different about doing business or having a Christian in my life. They lied to me like my other friends, ripped me off like my other bosses, whatever you want to put it there. God says, don't do that. Don't make my name common. This is what I would do. I would be honest. I wouldn't deal falsely. God doesn't deal falsely with us. He doesn't lie to us. He gives us what we need or what is coming at its proper time. People in this day and age oftentimes got paid daily, with no refrigeration and no way to really store things up for the average person. And so to hold something back daily was quite a thing. In the book of James, he talks a little bit about some rich people that were doing this. One day, Lord willing, when we get to the book of James, I'm going to enjoy the historical context as well for when James was speaking into this, but not tonight. In James chapter 5, he says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupt, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury, and you have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. James speaks to an issue of some people that were doing well, and they just decided because they were in that position or doing well, we're going to hold some of that back. And God says they're crying out to the Lord, who is the commander of the armies of God, the Lord of Sabaoth. He said, no, I'm not going to leave it be. So we're not to be like this. We're not to drag his name in the mud. Verse 14, you shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Now, it's got to be, some kind of person who curses the deaf person who can't hear them, or puts a stumbling block in front of a blind person. Now, whether that was literal or literal or figurative, I don't know. But either way, it came from the same heart and the same type of person, and God says, you're not going to do that. And so just as much as he would provide for the poor, he says, you're going to make sure that you take care of those who are disadvantaged, who can't care for themselves. I'm going to instruct you on these things. You're not going to disregard them. You're going to care for them, and you're going to love them. You're not going to be cowardly or disrespectful to the handicapped. Slander. As these talebearers would go around, slander. An awfully cruel word, a false statement or a damaging statement spoken against someone. The enemy of our soul, Satan, it is one of his many characteristics, one which we are not to repeat. They're also, unfortunately, a talebearer, someone who slanders, someone who speaks against another, also hurts themselves. According to The Independent, which was an English magazine, in 2014, the number of defamation actions brought over a derogatory post on social media has surged more than 300% in the last year. And I think we've seen that continue to go because social media has given a platform to a lot of people to speak a lot of things that they don't know. It's been well said, I guess, that you can't believe everything that you hear, but you can repeat it. And I think that's probably one of the scourges of how easy it is to hear and repeat things in such a connected world that we live in. Sir Walter Scott wrote, "Low-breathed talkers, minion lispers cutting honest throats by whispers." Oh, the day when they were just whispers. Now everybody seems to be shouting. But he says also in this that you're not gonna favor the poor nor the rich in your judgments. You're gonna justice is justice. Just as we would say, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. For the poor, for the rich, for the mighty, for the weak. So shall your judges and your justice be. It's not spiritual or unspiritual to be poor, neither is it spiritual or unspiritual to be rich. And he said that's especially going to come out in your justice. You will judge them by my word. By my word, not with your eyes. Verse 17, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So, don't just hold it in for all of you or us introverts. That's not good either. Just not to respond, because it says that you shall not hate your brother in your heart, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor. So not only are you not to harbor that, but you're also supposed to bring it out. You who are spiritual, go to such a one in a spirit of gentleness. It doesn't have to be, rebuke kind of has that oomph to it, but it doesn't have to. You can go to them in a spirit of gentleness. You can speak to them in a number of ways, but don't just hold it in, let it go, and you didn't say anything, so everybody thinks everything's fine and dandy, but in your heart, you're walking in sin for however long because you haven't dealt with it. That's not good either. Just because you didn't respond back or sin in what you said, you may just be sinning in what you haven't said or just holding it in and you hate them. You are not to hate your brother. I don't know. So love will rebuke, but he also reminds us that vengeance is God's. It belongs to him. And so as he closes kind of this first chunk with you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you're in the courtroom, if you're a stranger in a strange land, if you're a mother, if you're a father, if you're in any of these relationships or places, if you were deaf or you were blind, God says, and put yourself in that position, and that's the way you're to love them, as you would want to be in that position. You're going to love your neighbor as yourself. You're going to love that blind person. You're going to love that foreigner. You're going to love them all as yourself. He says, that's my standard. If you can't figure out what I've said, go back to that. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, in case we missed it in the Old Testament, the Lord reminds us in the New. Galatians 5:14 says, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So he takes this first section, and there are really kind of two sections in this chapter, and he says, we're going to combine it all, and said, just, if you missed any of this, apply this rule in this one word, this one statement, love them as yourself. So in verse 19, as it opens up this new section, it says, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you. So he opens the next section that will go through the end of the chapter, and he'll close it with, keep my statutes. So the basis of it is love your neighbor as yourself, but there is also the obedience in it all. Keep my statutes. Don't mix truth and error. Unequally yoked. Cup of blessing with the cup of demons. All statements that the Lord makes across the Scripture. But he brings this principle, and they're to bring it into every little detail of their life, to understand that we're going into Canaan and we're not supposed to mix. We're in Egypt and we're not supposed to mix. This non-mixture in their life. And whether it's old garment, new garment, old wineskin, new wineskin, there's this principle that God teaches his people in subtle ways throughout of not mixing. And you're going to honor me with your animals or with your clothing. Each material is to be handled different, worn different. And I kind of enjoyed that just a little bit, that as we have things that aren't necessarily, they're just different in our life, and even those things, we need to understand that there are different areas of our life that are handled differently. But he reminds us not to mix. Verse 20, whoever lies carnally with a woman who is betrothed to a man as a concubine, and who has not at all been redeemed nor given her freedom, for there shall be scourging, but they shall not be put to death because she was not free. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord, the door of the tabernacle of meeting, a ram as a trespass offering. The priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering before the Lord for his sin which he has committed, and the sin which he has committed shall be forgiven him. Sin just causes a mess. Though this was probably a slave girl eligible for marriage and may or may not, under the law of the land at the time, been able to do anything different, brings penalty in her life and his. But it says he's going to go because he has sinned. Sin brings a messy situation. She probably would have had to marry him after it. He would have to atone and seek forgiveness from the Lord. Verse 23, when you come into the land and have planted all kinds of trees for food, then you shall count their fruit as uncircumcised. 3 years it shall be as uncircumcised. 3 years it shall be uncircumcised to you, it shall not be eaten. But in the 4th year all its fruit shall be holy, a praise to the Lord. In the 5th year you shall eat its fruit, that it may yield to you its increase. I am the Lord your God. So as he teaches them not to mix, as he's teaching them restraint, especially as he reminds them, hey, you are going into the promised land. You're going into what's going to teach us about walking in a spirit-filled life. He says you're going to give some time where even after it begins to produce a little fruit, you're not going to start harvesting it yet. You're going to let it fall to the ground, or however they would have handled it. And then on the 4th year, and then especially on the 5th year, which you would start picking for yourself. But the ultimate goal was going into the promised land, and the ultimate goal was blessing, and blessing from strength. Show some restraint. Don't act on it as soon as it begins to bear some fruit. Let it get some strength. Let it begin to produce well. And it doesn't have anything to do with the text, but for me it was a reminder of how quickly we oftentimes will push our youth into producing fruit. Oftentimes we'll use our youth groups or our kids, even younger than that, older than that, to really being the evangelistic force of the church, or the ones that share the most, or as a way to get people into churches, or what have you. There's a million different approaches on that. But I think for me, this is just a word of wisdom that, as something is growing, and maybe it is producing some fruit, but don't be afraid to continue to give it a little time. Give it some time to continue to gain strength. Just because something's beginning to happen, you don't have to jump on it and get everything that you can out of it or off of it. Just, the Lord's working. It's going to be all right. Let him have his way and continue to grow. Verse 26, you shall not eat anything with the blood, nor shall you practice divination or soothsaying. You shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am the Lord. So as again, a few verses back, as he's prepping them to go into the promised land, going into Canaan, we've been talking about this for a couple chapters, that their practices that they were going to be walking into, he says, you're not going to do anything like that. And as you're going in there, they eat things with blood. They practice divination and soothsaying. And something that they would do for the dead in this pagan practice was that they would shave the sides of their beards, the sides of their head in a particular way. They would cut their flesh for the dead. And they would also tattoo themselves for the dead. God says, you're not going to do that. Now, that's not as much as I wouldn't care if it was, that's not a statement against tattoos. You won't find one specifically in Scripture. That's a statement against what they were doing for the dead and the practices that they were having. It says you're not going to do that in regards to how you mark your skin, cut your skin, or shave your beards or your head. You're not going to do that. You're going to be holy. Your body's going to be holy as well. So what is your purpose behind it when you do these things? And how you dress or how you shave or how you mark yourself? Because I think there's something interesting that should be noted if you have an exterior life, that whether it be in whatever, clothing, tattooing, or whatever, and you say, well, don't judge my heart, but your whole life can't be known whether you follow the Lord or not, except for a part of you that only God can know. Whether you can be a Christian or be saved, sure. But that's certainly not the desire of the Lord. It wasn't the desire for his people to say, well, I hope when you go in that the only ones who'll know that you're followers of me is me. He said, you're going to have a distinct and you're going to have a separate life. Now, where that ends in long hairs or whatever. I don't know. That which is not of faith is sin. That much is for sure. Because we have all sorts of pagan practices in our culture today. You know, and I've been in Mexico City on the Day of the Dead and Halloween and all that, and I hate Halloween. So does that mean that it's sin for some kid to go out in a teddy bear and get candy from the neighbor that loves him? Probably not. But again, it starts in the heart for the believer. And does it resemble something that actually is evil? Is there a clear line of distinction? And you'll have to answer most of that for yourself as you follow the Lord. But when he was talking to his people, he said, you're going to be distinctly different. You're going to dress like you're not of this world, but please don't dress like you're out of this world. He didn't say that. That's my addition, but... Verse 29. Do not prostitute your daughter to cause her to be a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry, and the land become full of wickedness. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. You wouldn't think he would have to command people this. Yet he does. He says, so influenced are you by the life and the world around you? I've got to tell you beforehand not to do something so horrible. Now, this was oftentimes a religious rite that they would put their child in as kind of a religious prostitute. And he says, you're going to go into this land that's defiled by this, and you're not going to do it. You know, it's the time that we spend, you know, I think of asking Eden, and she's heading out in a month to school and off to college, and we have several others that are going to do that, and the time that you take, and yes, I've been telling you since you were a kid, don't do this. Oh, you know, I would never do this. But God reminds his adults, and we should remind our young adults of these things and standing for righteousness and how to walk and how not to walk, even if it's redundant, as sometimes God, as we will feel as we go through these laws and over. And yes, I know, and who in the world would do that? But God says it's a real temptation. There are real temptations that you think you would never do that you wind up doing. And I'm reminding you again. An interesting one that'll be interesting to see how it comes to light as I need to wind up wrapped up with this chapter, but I don't know if any of you guys have watched a little bit on the Epstein case. A billionaire or multimillionaire, depending on who you read, but he's probably a billionaire. There's more details than I'm going to go into. But for a number of years, and it's resurfaced, and he's being prosecuted for alleged, haven't been proven yet, for sex trafficking, abuse, and rape of dozens of girls. And what's going to be interesting about it all is that he has had friends and relationships at the highest levels of the land. And I tell you that, and especially sex trafficking of young boys and girls has been a scourge, is a horrible plague in our country right now. And you would think that, you know, if the Lord was telling the people on the Mayflower, now when you come into America, make sure you don't sell your children for perverse actions all across your country. No problem. Who would do that? This is why we need to continually come back to the Lord, reverence his Sabbath, spend time with him, because in our flesh we are certainly capable. We are certainly capable of the worst things, and God reminds us. Verse 31, give no regard to mediums and familiar spirits. Do not seek after them to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the presence of an old man, and fear your God. I am the Lord. And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Don't leave God for something you make for your hands, and don't leave God for seeking spiritual things another way. He is the one to do that. So he says you're not going to go after familiar spirits. You're not going to seek and consult mediums. You know, there was a person one time couldn't stand mediums, those who were, you know, taking part in the witchcraft and spirituality. And this medium was standing there just smiling at this person. And they just couldn't take it. So they finally just slapped this medium. They wound up in court, and the judge said, well, you know, why did you do that? And the person said, well, you know, I can't help myself. I have to strike a happy medium. That's not appropriate, but I couldn't help myself. There's a street level holiness in all of this, honesty and practicality, because he's the Lord. The Lord expects it, and it is what he would do. Verse 35, you shall do no injustice in judgment, in measurement of length, weight, or volume. You shall have honest scales, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe all my statutes and all my judgments and perform them. I am the Lord. All of these flow out of a relationship with the Lord. As Peter would say, you know, you add to your faith this, and you add to your faith this, and you add to your faith this, and you're not going to be barren nor unfruitful in your life with Jesus Christ if you add these things to your life. It is a continuation of the relationship between God and his people. And there are responsibilities that we have in having him as our Lord and our Savior. But also vice versa. There are things that he promises and he will empower you to do. So if I had to bring all this together, it would be love and respect of both in every position and aspect of life, a street level holiness of being like Jesus Christ in our job and in our families and our walk with him. So Father, we thank you for this night. And as we ask, what would you do, Lord, as if you had to set up a shop and make your money selling farm goods or whatever? You said, well, you'd be honest and you'd be fair. And Lord, you want us to be holy like you are holy. Help us to plan for the future in tough situations where there will be temptations. Help us to be honest and people of integrity in our relationships, whether we are the younger or the older. And in all points, Lord, may we love them, Lord, as we love ourselves. In Jesus' name.